Picture a world where the very air seems to shimmer with gold dust, a time when American industrial fortunes were being made overnight, creating a new aristocracy of wealth so vast it could build marble palaces and buy entire wardrobes of Parisian couture. This was the Gilded Age, an era defined by its breathtaking opulence. But for the women at the very pinnacle of this society, the glittering surface often concealed a profound and painful reality. The grand ballrooms and sprawling estates were not just homes. They were stages upon which a carefully scripted performance of perfection was demanded. And the ultimate ambition for a new money heiress, the crowning achievement her family tirelessly pursued, was a title. Not just any title, but an ancient one, steeped in the history and prestige of a European aristocratic lineage. It was a transaction that seemed to promise everything: social validation, a permanent place among the global elite, and a legacy for her children. But this exchange came with a hidden and often devastating cost. We are about to step into the world of the society wife trapped in a gilded cage. She possessed everything that money could possibly purchase. Her jewels were real, her silks were the finest, and her name was now etched into the pages of Debrets' peerage. Yet, for all her material riches, she was robbed of the most fundamental currency of all: autonomy. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the intricate web of social obligations, to the relentless scrutiny of a judgmental aristocracy, and to the husband who held the key to both her fortune and her future. This is the ultimate paradox of the Gilded Age heiress, a woman who traded the vibrant, if sometimes vulgar, freedom of new money for the silent, suffocating constraints of old world tradition. Her cage was not made of iron bars, but of expectations. It was gilded with the purest gold, lined with the most exquisite velvet, yet it was a prison all the same. So let's pull back that heavy velvet curtain and venture beyond the dazzling facade. This is a journey into the heart of one of history's most fascinating and heartbreaking arrangements. We will meet the women who lived this reality, exploring their triumphs, their quiet despairs, and the ingenious ways they sometimes found to rattle the bars of their magnificent enclosures. This is a story about the price of prestige, the weight of a crown, and the human spirit's enduring quest for freedom, even when it is dressed in silk and diamonds. It's a tale that resonates far beyond the ballrooms of the 19th century, touching on universal themes of ambition, sacrifice, and the complex choices we make in the name of love, family, and social standing. Prepare to discover the real lives hidden behind the grand portraits and the sensational headlines. To truly grasp the nature of this confinement, we need to understand the specific architecture of the cage itself. It wasn't simply a feeling of being restricted. It was a tangible, all-encompassing social system built on centuries of tradition. For a woman like Consuelo Vanderbilt or Jenny Jerome, life after the wedding was a complete immersion into a world governed by a code of conduct as rigid and intricate as the steel frames of the skyscrapers her father might have built back home. The walls of this cage were constructed from the absolute expectations of her new title. A duchess did not simply wake up and decide how to spend her day. Her schedule was dictated by the social season, by court presentations, by the endless rounds of calls that had to be made and received in a precise order of precedence. Every public appearance was a performance. Her clothing, her demeanor, even the tilt of her head subject to intense scrutiny. A misstep wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a stain on the honor of an ancient family name, a name she had been purchased to burnish with her new money. Another formidable bar in this gilded enclosure was the relentless pressure to secure the lineage. The primary duty of an aristocratic wife, beyond being a decorative asset, was to produce a male heir. This was not a private hope, but a public and urgent necessity. The future of the estate, the title, the entire legacy depended on her ability to bear a son. The birth of daughters was often met with polite disappointment, turning what should be a joyful event into a source of immense anxiety. With each pregnancy, the weight of expectation grew heavier. This biological imperative reduced a woman's role to that of a vessel for the continuation of a dynasty, where her personal health and happiness were secondary to the cold demands of primogeniture. The freedom and relative informality of her American upbringing must have felt like a distant dream in the face of such immense, inescapable pressure. Perhaps the most insidious element, however, was the pervasive social hypocrisy that surrounded her. She was officially welcomed into the highest echelons of society, yet she often remained an outsider, subtly marginalized by the very people who had so eagerly accepted her family's million. The term dollar princess itself was a double-edged sword. It acknowledged her wealth while simultaneously reminding her that her entry was transactional. Her fortune was coveted and desperately needed to restore crumbling castles and fund lavish lifestyles. But her American accent, her direct manner, her family's roots in trade could be sources of quiet condescension. She was expected to bankroll a way of life she was never fully allowed to inhabit as an equal. This created a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness that no amount of jewels or servants could alleviate. She was trapped between two worlds, no longer entirely American, yet never quite fully European, perpetually performing the part of a noble lady while being quietly reminded of her commercial origins. This was the essence of the Gilded Cage, a life of spectacular material privilege built upon a foundation of profound personal compromise. This entire system operated like a meticulously calibrated economic engine, a transatlantic pipeline fueled by desperation on both sides. On one shore stood America's new industrial titans, men who had amassed fortunes so immense they rivaled the treasuries of small nations. Think of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built a railroad empire, or John Jacob Astor, whose wealth came from fur and real estate. They lived in palaces on Fifth Avenue, their tables set with gold cutlery, but for all their financial power, they were often shut out of the innermost circles of New York's old money elite. Families like the Knickerbockers who traced their lineage back to the Dutch settlers. These established families viewed the Vanderbilts and their peers as vulgar arrivistes, their money too new, their manners too loud. No matter how many millions they accrued, a certain social ceiling remained firmly in place. The ultimate validation, the final stamp of legitimacy, could not be bought in America. It had to be imported from Europe, where titles came with centuries of history attached. Across the ocean, the situation was a perfect mirror image. British aristocrats, from dukes to barons, presided over sprawling ancestral estates, owned vast tracts of land, and their names were recorded in the sacred texts of the peerage. But by the late 19th century, many of these grand families were facing financial ruin. The agricultural depression had slashed the income from their lands, while the sheer cost of maintaining a stately home, with its army of servants, its endless repairs, and the social obligation to live in a certain style, was astronomical. They were asset-rich but cash-poor, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, surrounded by symbols of wealth they could no longer afford. A title was a heavy crown indeed when the roof of your castle was leaking. For these nobles, an infusion of American capital wasn't just desirable. It was a necessity for survival, a way to restore their patrimony and secure their lineage without having to stoop to something as déclassé as going into trade themselves. And so a marketplace emerged, cynical, efficient, and utterly transactional. The currency was not pounds or dollars, but lineage and liquidity. A duke with a crumbling castle, but an impeccable bloodline could offer a social coronation. A railroad magnate with $20 million, but a lingering social slight, could offer a rescue operation. The bridging asset, the crucial commodity that facilitated this exchange, was the heiress. Typically, a young woman, freshly debuted into society, educated in the feminine arts, and raised with the explicit understanding that her primary purpose was to form an advantageous marriage. She was the perfect solution, a socially acceptable vessel through which a fortune could be transferred without the overt stigma of a business deal. Her youth and innocence were assets, making her malleable and less likely to protest the terms of the arrangement. This pipeline was not left to chance. It was actively managed by ambitious mothers, often dubbed dowager empresses or mamas, who would transport their daughters to London for the social season. They rented lavish homes on Park Lane, threw extravagant parties, and strategically placed their daughters in the path of eligible, if financially embarrassed, aristocrats. Negotiations were handled with the precision of a corporate merger, with lawyers and agents discreetly verifying the size of the dowry and the authenticity of the title. The young woman at the center of it all was often the last to be consulted, her feelings considered secondary to the monumental social and financial stakes involved. She was, in the most literal sense, the perfect prey, valuable, vulnerable, and raised to be compliant, caught in a crosscurrent of old world ambition and new world money that would ultimately determine the course of her life. The very blueprint for this luxurious confinement was often drawn up by the person a young woman should have been able to trust most, her own mother. These formidable matriarchs, figures like Alva Vanderbilt, were not mere spectators in the marital marketplace. They were its master strategists, its most determined engineers. Having fought their own brutal battles for social acceptance within the cutthroat world of New York's elite, they saw a European title not as a mere accessory, but as the ultimate and irrevocable victory. It was the final, unassailable proof that their family had truly arrived, that no door, no matter how ancient or exclusive, would ever be closed to them again. For a woman like Alva, who had famously battled to break into Mrs. Astor's inner circle, securing a dukedom for her daughter was the ultimate checkmate in a lifelong game of social chess. Her motivation was a complex brew of fierce maternal ambition, a desire to secure her family's place in history, and a deeply ingrained belief that this was simply what was required of their station. In her mind, she wasn't sacrificing her daughter's happiness. She was guaranteeing her a position of unparalleled security and prestige for generations to come. The methods these mothers employed were as systematic as any corporate takeover. They would orchestrate entire seasons around the hunt for a title, transplanting their families to London and immersing their daughters in a whirlwind of balls, dinners, and country house parties specifically designed as a showcase. Every detail was meticulously managed, from the exquisite gowns designed to attract attention to the careful cultivation of alliances with influential society hostesses who could provide the necessary introductions. The daughter became a project, her every word and gesture polished to meet the exacting standards of the British aristocracy. Any sign of resistance, any flicker of independent thought or romantic inclination that did not align with the strategic goal was swiftly and firmly corrected. The message was clear. Personal desire was a frivolous luxury they could not afford. The family's ascent was the only objective that mattered. The mother, who held the purse strings and the social leverage, effectively became the warden of her daughter's future, holding the key to the gilded cage even before the marriage contract was signed. This dynamic created a heartbreaking paradox. The very person who was supposed to be a young woman's protector and advocate became the primary agent of her confinement. Consider the infamous case of Consuelo Vanderbilt's engagement to the Duke of Marlborough. Alva Vanderbilt, determined to secure one of the most illustrious titles in England, reportedly locked her daughter in her room and emotionally pressured her until she consented to break off her attachment to another suitor and accept the Duke's proposal. Consuelo walked down the aisle weeping, her personal dreams sacrificed on the altar of her mother's ambition. In that moment, Alva was not just arranging a marriage. She was personally locking the cage door, believing with every fiber of her being that she was placing her daughter in a world of safety and splendor. It was a profound act of love as she saw it, yet it was also an act of immense control, blurring the line between maternal duty and ruthless social calculation. These mothers, victims of the same rigid social structures, ultimately became its most effective enforcers, perpetuating a cycle where a woman's value was measured by her marital conquest, a belief system that trapped them every bit as much as it trapped their daughters. Of all the society wives whose lives became cautionary tales, none so perfectly embodies the tragedy of the gilded cage as Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her story is the archetype, a narrative so poignant it seems almost fictional. Born into one of America's greatest fortunes, Consuelo was the only daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and the formidable Alva. From a young age, she was groomed for a specific destiny, raised with the understanding that her extraordinary beauty, grace, and vast inheritance were not for her own enjoyment, but were assets to be deployed in the service of the family's social ascent. She was a princess in training, but for a kingdom she had not chosen. The pressure to secure a title reached a fever pitch when Consuelo was just 17. Alva Vanderbilt, having set her sights on the highest echelons of the British aristocracy, identified Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, as the ultimate prize. Sonny, as he was known, was the owner of Blenheim Palace, a monumental estate that was both a national treasure and a financial millstone around his neck. The match was, on paper, perfect. His ancient title and her immense fortune were the exact commodities needed by the other. There was, however, one significant complication. Consuelo was deeply, secretly in love with an American suitor, Winthrop Rutherford. He was handsome, charming, and represented a life of genuine affection and relative freedom. But to Alva, a mere American match, no matter how sincere, was a catastrophic failure of ambition. What followed was a campaign of emotional manipulation that reveals the chilling lengths to which these social architects would go. When Consuelo resisted the Duke's proposal, Alva did not merely persuade. She besieged her own daughter. Reports from the time, including Consuelo's own later memoirs, describe Alva feigning a serious, life-threatening heart condition, declaring that the stress of Consuelo's defiance would be the death of her. She allegedly locked Consuelo in her room, isolating her from any outside influence, and subjected her to a relentless barrage of guilt and duty. The message was unambiguous. Her mother's very life and the honor of the Vanderbilt name depended entirely on her capitulation. Faced with this unbearable burden, the young woman's resolve broke. She agreed to the marriage, sacrificing her personal happiness on the altar of familial obligation. The wedding, on a crisp November day in 1895, was a spectacle of almost unimaginable opulence. New York society turned out in force, crowding St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue to witness what was billed as the wedding of the century. Consuelo wore a gown of exquisite Brussels lace, a train so long it required multiple pages to carry it, and a diamond tiara that sparkled under the church lights. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and the murmur of approval from the most powerful guests in the city. But behind the glorious facade, a different scene was unfolding. Observers noted that the bride's face was pale and streaked with quiet tears. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she was not a radiant bride embarking on a romantic adventure. She was a prisoner marching toward her sentence. The grandeur of the ceremony was not a celebration of love, but a magnificent smokescreen for a profound and public transaction. The Gilded Cage had its newest occupant, and the door swung shut with the finality of the wedding vows. Yet for Consuelo, the true nature of her cage became apparent not in the palace's grandeur, but in its daily, chilling reality. Blenheim was magnificent, yes, but it was also a monumental burden. The vast rooms were notoriously difficult to heat, often feeling damp and bitterly cold. The sheer scale of the place could be isolating. One could walk for minutes through corridor after corridor without encountering another soul. This physical discomfort was a constant reminder that her new life was built on foundations of tradition, not comfort. Her primary purpose, the unspoken clause in her marital contract, was to secure the Marlborough line. The pressure to produce an heir was immense and immediate. In this, Consuelo fulfilled her duty with remarkable speed, giving birth to two sons, first John in 1897 and then Ivor in 1898. The birth of the heir and a spare should have solidified her position, but instead, it highlighted the transactional nature of her marriage. Once her biological obligation was met, her husband, the Duke, had little use for her companionship. The man she had married, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, proved to be as cold and imposing as his ancestral home. He was a man deeply conscious of his own status and resentful of the financial dependence that came with his American bride. He showed her little affection, treating her more as a necessary acquisition than a partner. His primary interest was in her fortune, which he used to restore Blenheim's roof, replenish its art collection, and fund the extravagant lifestyle expected of his station. He was also frequently unfaithful, conducting affairs with other women, a common practice among aristocratic men of the era that was socially tolerated but personally devastating for their wives. For Consuelo, a young woman raised with some romantic expectation, this emotional abandonment within the cavernous halls of Blenheim must have been a profound and lonely torment. She was the bankroller and the beautiful hostess, the woman who brought the palace back to life, yet she remained utterly alone at the center of it all. Her days were filled with the stifling routine of prescribed rituals that offered little intellectual or emotional fulfillment. As the Duchess, her life was a calendar of social obligations, managing the household staff, planning elaborate dinners, and acting as a gracious hostess for countless weekend parties. While this may sound glamorous, it was a role devoid of genuine agency. Every decision, from the menu to the seating arrangements, was governed by strict protocol and the ultimate approval of the Duke. She was a performer on a constant public stage. The vibrant intellectual curiosity she had possessed was given no outlet. Her opinions on politics or art were neither sought nor valued. The boredom was as relentless as the cold. She was trapped in a gilded cycle of entertaining and being entertained, her identity submerged beneath the weight of her title. She was an ornament, a trophy displayed to prove the Duke's successful navigation of the New World, yet she was never permitted to be her own person, to express the individuality that her American upbringing had fostered. The cage was exquisitely decorated, but the confinement was absolute. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough, the turning point did not arrive with a dramatic declaration, but with a slow, steady accumulation of quiet rebellions. The First World War proved to be a catalyst, fracturing the rigid social structures that had confined her. With her husband away on official duties, Consuelo found a new sense of purpose. She threw her energy and her fortune into the war effort, transforming the grand spaces of Blenheim Palace into a hospital for wounded soldiers. This was not the decorative hostessing of the past. This was active, meaningful work. For the first time in her adult life, she was making decisions, managing staff, and providing genuine comfort to those in need. This work gave her a taste of autonomy, a glimpse of a life defined by contribution rather than consumption. It also brought her into contact with a wider world, with people from different classes and backgrounds, further highlighting the suffocating artificiality of her own aristocratic existence. The end of the war left a changed world in its wake. The old certainties of the Edwardian era had been shattered in the trenches, and with them, the unassailable authority of the aristocracy began to crumble. Social mores were shifting, and for women, the fight for suffrage had ignited a broader conversation about personal rights and freedoms. While divorce remained a profound scandal, especially within the highest ranks of society, it was no longer the unthinkable social suicide it once had been. This changing atmosphere provided a crucial backdrop for Consuelo's own deliberations. She was no longer the terrified 17-year-old girl who had been coerced into a marriage. She was a woman in her 40s who had endured decades of emotional neglect and her husband's public infidelities. The cage, while still gilded, felt increasingly intolerable. Her path to freedom was a long and deliberate one, marked by a gradual assertion of independence. She began spending more time away from Blenheim, traveling and cultivating a circle of friends separate from her husband's. She deepened her involvement in philanthropy, particularly focusing on women's and children's health, work that gave her life a sense of meaning that her marriage never could. The final decisive break came in 1921. After years of living essentially separate lives, Consuelo made the bold decision to seek a divorce. The proceedings were a landmark case, conducted with as much discretion as possible, but still creating headlines across 2 continents. The grounds were the Duke's adultery, a fact that was hardly a secret. The divorce was granted, and with it, Consuelo Vanderbilt finally stepped out of the gilded cage that had defined her for over 25 years. Her later life stands as a powerful testament to the woman she was always meant to be. In 1921, she married for a second time, this time to a French aviator and diplomat named Jacques Balsan. This union was the polar opposite of her first. It was a marriage based on mutual affection, shared interests, and genuine companionship. Balsan admired her for her intelligence and spirit, not her bank account. Together, they lived a life of warmth and relative simplicity, dividing their time between France and the United States. Consuelo continued her philanthropic work, wrote her revealing memoirs, and finally experienced the personal happiness that had been so cruelly denied to her in her youth. The trajectory of her life tells a story of reclamation. She had been sold into a world of cold splendor, but through immense courage in a changing world, she managed to reclaim her own narrative, exchanging the weight of a diamond tiara for the lightness of a life lived on her own terms. But if Consuelo Vanderbilt's story represents the classic tragedy of the gilded cage, then Jenny Jerome's presents a far more complex and fascinating variation. She was in many ways the prototype, the original dollar princess, whose life defied simple categorization. Where Consuelo was molded by a domineering mother, Jenny was a force of nature in her own right, vibrant, fiercely intelligent, and possessing an audacious charm that captivated everyone she met. The daughter of the financier Leonard Jerome, she was raised in an atmosphere of cosmopolitan sophistication between New York and Paris, encouraged to be witty, well-read, and politically aware. Her cage, when she entered it, was not the cold, stately home of a duke, but the heated, intensely public arena of British politics. And her struggle was not one of passive suffering, but of active, often reckless, rebellion. Her entry into this world was characteristically dramatic. While attending a yacht race in Cowes in 1873, the 20-year-old Jenny met Lord Randolph Churchill, the charismatic and ambitious younger son of the Duke of Marlborough. Their courtship was a whirlwind, a genuine love match that burned with an intensity that shocked both their families. They became engaged after just 3 days. This was no drawn-out negotiation. It was a passionate elopement of sorts, albeit a socially acceptable one. The Churchills, while initially resistant to the American bride, were eventually won over by the Jerome fortune, which was desperately needed to fund Randolph's political career. Jenny entered her marriage not as a coerced pawn, but as an enthusiastic partner, believing she was joining a team destined for greatness. However, the role of a politician's wife in Victorian England proved to be its own unique form of confinement. While she had more freedom of movement than a duchess isolated on a country estate, her life was circumscribed by a different set of rules. She was expected to be the perfect hostess, the charming and decorative supporter of her husband's ambitions, but never the strategist. Her own sharp intellect and natural political instincts were assets to be used for Randolph's benefit, not for her own fulfillment. She could influence from the sidelines, whispering in ears at dinner parties and managing his social calendar with precision, but she could never claim public credit. This chafed terribly against her independent spirit. She was a woman born to lead, forced to perpetually follow a few steps behind her husband. As Randolph's career soared and then spectacularly crashed due to his own political miscalculations and ill health, Jenny's frustration grew. Her cage was the claustrophobic world of Westminster gossip and societal expectation. Her response was not quiet despair, but open defiance. She became famous for her numerous love affairs, which were not discreet secrets, but poorly kept scandals. Her lovers included high-profile figures like the Austrian diplomat Count Charles Kinsky, and much later, a man many years her junior. These affairs were certainly a search for passion and companionship missing in her marriage, but they were also a powerful, deliberate act of rebellion. They were her way of asserting control over her own body and her own life, a declaration that she would not be defined solely by her husband's failures or society's narrow rules. Yet, this very rebellion created a new, more complicated cage. Each scandal tightened the chains of gossip and judgment, limiting her social influence and potentially damaging what was left of her husband's reputation. Her affairs, while expressions of freedom, also made her vulnerable to blackmail and social exile. She was trapped in a cycle. The more the system constrained her, the more she rebelled, and the more she rebelled, the more the system sought to punish her. She could rattle the bars with tremendous noise, but she could never fully break them. Her spirited nature allowed her to live a much more vivid and exciting life than Consuelo, but it also exposed her to greater risks and a different kind of emotional turmoil. She demonstrated that even the most formidable woman could not single-handedly dismantle the patriarchal structures she inhabited. She could only find ways to navigate them, often at a great personal cost. Her greatest legacy, of course, would be her son, Winston, to whom she was a devoted, if unconventional, mother, pouring her ambition and intellect into his upbringing, ensuring that her own stifled potential would find its ultimate expression in one of history's most consequential figures. Imagine the sheer sensory whiplash of that journey. A young woman like Consuelo Vanderbilt, raised in the electrifying hustle of New York City, where everything was new, fast, and loud. Her world was one of brownstone mansions lit by brilliant electric lights, of carriage rides through Central Park, of a society that, for all its rules, still possessed a certain brash and democratic energy. Then she steps onto the deck of an ocean liner, crosses the Atlantic, and arrives in England. The air itself feels different, heavier, damper, thick with the scent of ancient stone and old wood. Her new home is in a modern palace on Fifth Avenue. It's a centuries-old country house, its foundations laid long before her own nation was even born. The transition was more than a change of address. It was a leap across centuries into a social landscape, as foreign and rigid as a medieval court. The first and most daunting challenge was the etiquette. American high society had its own elaborate rulebook, governed by figures like Ward McAllister and Mrs. Astor, but it was a mere pamphlet compared to the volumes of unwritten law that governed the British aristocracy. Every action, from the way one poured tea to the specific angle of a greeting, was codified. A New York hostess might fret over the placement of a guest at a dinner party. An English duchess had to master the precise order of precedence for every person in the room, a hierarchy based on titles so ancient and convoluted it required its own reference book, Debrets Peerage. The simple act of leaving a calling card became a high-stakes ritual. Cards had to be delivered on specific days, at specific times, turned down at exactly the right corner to convey the correct message. For a woman used to the relative directness of American communication, this labyrinth of nuance was exhausting. A single misstep could brand her as an irredeemable provincial, a clumsy American who would never truly belong. Then there were the family dynamics. In New York, while families were ambitious, the power structure was typically patriarchal and relatively straightforward. In England, she was marrying into an entire ecosystem. There was often a formidable dowager, the mother of the groom, who had ruled the household for decades and was not inclined to relinquish her authority to a young interloper from the colonies, no matter how rich she was. There were sisters-in-law, aunts, and cousins, all watching with a critical eye, ready to pounce on any sign of incompetence or impropriety. The new bride was expected to seamlessly insert herself into this pre-existing web of alliances and resentments, to learn its secret languages and unspoken feuds, all while under the constant pressure of her primary duty, producing an heir. It was a political campaign waged within the walls of her own home, where she had few allies and every move was scrutinized. Perhaps the most painful adjustment was facing the pervasive, often thinly veiled, snobbery. The British aristocracy prided itself on bloodlines, on a lineage that could be traced back to the Norman conquest. Money, in their view, was a necessary but somewhat vulgar reality. They were willing to accept American dollars to replant their gardens and re-slate their roofs, but they were far less willing to accept the people attached to them as true equals. The term dollar princess itself was a backhanded compliment, a constant reminder of her origin. She might be called Your Grace, but she could sense the condescension in the drawing room when she spoke, the subtle exchanges of glances when her American accent peeked through. Comments about her family's roots in trade railroads, shipping dry goods, were never far from the surface, a way of putting her in her place. She was the solution to their financial crisis, yet she was also the embodiment of everything they supposedly disdained. This created a profound and lonely hypocrisy. She was both the savior of the estate and a permanent outsider, celebrated for her wealth, but never fully embraced for herself. The grandeur of her surroundings, therefore, became a constant echo chamber for her isolation, a magnificent backdrop against which she played the part of the prized, but never quite welcome, guest. The legal architecture of this arrangement was perhaps its most cunning feature, transforming what might have been a simple financial transaction into a near inescapable system of control. At the heart of every dollar princess's story lies the marriage contract, a document that was far less a celebration of union than a meticulous blueprint for financial subjugation. When a family like the Vanderbilts agreed to a dowry, they weren't just giving a generous gift. They were legally transferring a fortune, often in the millions of dollars, directly into the hands of the groom. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a concrete surrender of economic power. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, which governed marriages in both Britain and America at the time, a woman's legal identity was effectively erased upon marriage. She became a femme covert, her existence covered by that of her husband. Any property she owned, any income she generated, any inheritance she received, instantly became his. Her signature was legally void. She could not enter into contracts or sue in court. She was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband. To the families negotiating these deals, this might have seemed like a necessary evil, the price of admission to the aristocratic world. They believed the grandeur of the title and the security of the estate would provide for their daughter. But the reality was a life of carefully managed dependency. The marriage contract often included something called a marriage settlement, a provision that sounds generous but was fundamentally restrictive. This settlement would designate a small annual allowance for the wife, known as pin money. The term itself is telling, suggesting an amount just sufficient for the most trivial of feminine purchases, pins for her dresses, ribbons, perhaps small charitable donations. This allowance was hers to spend at her discretion, but its size was intentionally meager, a pittance compared to the vast wealth she had brought into the marriage. It was enough to maintain the appearance of a wealthy duchess, but nowhere near enough to grant her true independence. The cruel irony is that her own fortune was being used all around her, yet she had no say in its expenditure. The millions from her dowry were immediately put to work, shoring up the very system that confined her. They repaired the crumbling battlements of ancient castles, drained the marshes on neglected estates, and replenished art collections that had been sold off by previous generations. Her money funded her husband's political campaigns, his gambling debts, his mistresses, and the extravagant lifestyle expected of his station. She lived surrounded by the visible evidence of her financial contribution. The restored portraits of his ancestors gazing down from walls her money had saved. Yet she remained a pensioner in her own home. This created a profound psychological trap. She was constantly reminded of her value as a financial asset, while being systematically stripped of any agency over that value. Any request for funds beyond her pin money required her to appeal to her husband, a humiliating process that reinforced her subordinate position. This financial stranglehold was the single greatest barrier to escape. For a woman like Consuelo Vanderbilt, contemplating divorce was not just a social scandal. It was a leap into economic oblivion. If she left, she would leave with nothing. The fortune was legally her husband's. The homes, the jewels, the income, all of it would remain behind. She would be cast out with only her personal belongings and her tarnished reputation, facing a world with few respectable options for a woman of her background. She could not simply go into business or claim her share of the wealth. The law was unequivocally on the husband's side. This economic reality locked the cage door more securely than any social convention ever could. It forced women to weigh their personal misery against the prospect of destitution. a calculation that kept countless heiresses trapped in lonely splendor for decades. The gilding on the cage, therefore, was not just for show. It was a potent symbol of the fortune that both enabled her luxurious prison and ensured she could never afford to leave it. For these women, the grand ball or the weekend house party was not a leisure activity. It was a high-stakes battlefield where their social standing was either fortified or shattered with a single whispered comment. The performance began long before the first guest arrived. Every detail, from the specific shade of her gown to the precise arrangement of flowers on the dining table, was a strategic decision. She was expected to be a living emblem of her husband's success, her appearance a silent testament to the wise investment he had made in acquiring her. This meant adhering to the very latest fashions from Paris, often requiring multiple changes of elaborate, constricting outfits throughout a single day. A morning walk called for one ensemble, luncheon demanded another, afternoon tea a third, and the evening's ball required a final, breathtaking transformation into a vision of silk, lace, and jewels. The sheer physical toll of this was immense, a marathon of dressing and undressing, of being laced into corsets and having her hair styled for hours, all while maintaining an air of effortless grace. The role of hostess was particularly demanding. A successful weekend party at a country estate like Blenheim or Chatsworth was a logistical and social triumph that could cement a family's influence for a season. The society wife was the director of this intricate production. She had to master the Byzantine rules of precedence to create a seating chart that would flatter the most important guests without insulting the others. She needed to be a conversational chameleon, able to discuss politics with a cabinet minister, art with a curator, and horses with a sporting gentleman, all while ensuring the champagne flowed and no one was ever left standing alone. Her smile had to be constant, her demeanor unflappable, even if she had just argued bitterly with her husband or received distressing news from home. There was no room for a bad day. A moment of visible irritation, a hint of fatigue, or a lapse in conversation could be seized upon by rivals and turned into a damaging story that would circulate through drawing rooms for weeks. This relentless demand to perform perfection created a profound and lonely dissonance. Consider the scene at a glittering royal ball. The orchestra plays, crystal chandeliers cast a golden light, and the society wife waltzes in the arms of a diplomat, her face a serene mask of contentment. Yet beneath the surface, she might be consumed with worry about a sick child left in the nursery, or aching from a cruel remark her husband made hours before, or simply numb with a deep existential boredom. The gap between her inner reality and her public persona was a chasm she was forced to bridge every single day. She had to project an image of marital bliss, even if her marriage was a cold, transactional arrangement, and demonstrate maternal devotion, while her children were largely raised by a team of nannies and governesses. The mask of elegance was not just for show. It was a survival mechanism, a protective barrier between her true self and a world that was eager to criticize her slightest vulnerability. The consequence of dropping this mask, even for an instant, was social ruin. In an era before mass media, reputation was everything, and it was policed by a ruthless network of society hostesses and gossips. A single misstep, being seen in the same gown twice, a poorly received joke, showing too much interest in another woman's husband, could lead to a subtle but devastating ostracization. Invitations would slowly dry up. Her calls would go unreturned. The very people who had fawned over her would suddenly become distant. This was a fate worse than any private misery, as it stripped her of the only purpose she was allowed to have, being a successful social figure. The fear of this exclusion forced a level of self-control that was utterly exhausting. It required a perpetual vigilance over every word, every gesture, every fleeting expression that crossed her face. The grandeur of her life, therefore, was a stage upon she was both the star performer and the most critically judged prisoner, forever smiling for an audience that was watching for the first sign of a crack in the magnificent facade. And so, beneath the glittering performance of the public stage, lay a profound and aching emptiness. For all the crowds of servants and the constant whirl of social engagements, the society wife often inhabited a world of profound solitude. This loneliness was not the simple result of being physically alone. It was a deeper, more existential isolation, born from the very nature of her marriage. These unions were, at their core, business contracts, sealed with a handshake and a bank draft rather than a pledge of the heart. The concept of romantic love was a luxury these arrangements could seldom afford. A husband might respect his wife as a business partner, appreciate her beauty as a social asset, and value her for the heirs she produced. But the tender intimacy of a true companionship was frequently absent. This emotional vacancy was often compounded by the husband's own pursuits. It was an open secret among the aristocracy that men of title often maintained mistresses, viewing these relationships as an accepted and separate part of their lives. After fulfilling his duty to secure the lineage, a duke might retreat to a discreet London apartment, leaving his duchess behind in the cavernous silence of the country estate. She would be surrounded by the evidence of his wealth and power, the portraits, the tapestries, the acres of manicured land, but the master of the house was conspicuously absent. The vastness of a home like Blenheim Palace, which could feel isolating even when full of guests, became a crushing void when empty. The echoing footsteps in a marble hall, the long, dark corridors at night. These were the sounds and sights of a solitude that was both literal and deeply metaphorical. Making matters worse was the complex social minefield of friendship. A young American heiress was strictly forbidden from forming close, personal friendships with men outside her marriage. Any such association, no matter how innocent, would be immediately misconstrued and could spark a scandal that would destroy her reputation. Yet, finding genuine companionship among women was equally challenging. The established aristocratic ladies, who traced their lineages back for generations, often viewed the dollar princess with a mixture of jealousy and condescension. They needed her money, but they rarely accepted her as one of their own. Her American directness could be seen as vulgar, her family's wealth as nouveau rich, and her very presence as a threat to the old order. She was in many ways a permanent outsider, suspected by the very circle she was brought in to save. The result was a life of being perpetually surrounded, yet utterly alone. She presided over tables of 20 for dinner, engaging in sparkling conversation, but returned to a private bedroom that felt achingly empty. She was the center of attention at a ball, yet had no one to confide in about her deepest sorrows or simplest joys. Her children, while a source of love, were often raised by a staff of nannies and governesses, following the aristocratic custom of the time, which created another layer of distance. This unique form of loneliness, the isolation that exists within a crowd, is perhaps the most poignant hallmark of the Gilded Cage. It was a hunger that no amount of caviar or champagne could satisfy, a quiet desperation that persisted behind the most brilliant and unwavering of social smiles. Yet even amidst this crushing loneliness and elaborate social theater, no pressure was more immediate or more defining than the relentless biological imperative to produce a male heir. This was not a hopeful wish for a family. It was the central, non-negotiable clause in the marital contract. The entire multi-million-dollar transaction, the careful negotiations between families, the uprooting of a young woman's life, all of it was predicated on one fundamental outcome: the continuation of the aristocratic bloodline. A daughter might inherit her mother's beauty or intelligence, but she could not inherit the title, the estate, or the political seat. Only a son could secure the dynasty, ensuring that centuries of lineage did not abruptly end. This singular focus transformed the most intimate aspect of a woman's life into a public and intensely monitored project. The anxiety surrounding this duty was all-consuming and began almost from the moment the wedding ceremony concluded. Every month that passed without a pregnancy announcement was a cause for whispered concern. Once pregnant, the wife was treated as a precious, yet fragile, asset. Her health was monitored with an urgency that had little to do with her personal well-being and everything to do with the successful delivery of a healthy boy. She might be confined to bed, her diet strictly regulated, and her social engagements limited, all in the name of protecting the heir. The immense physical discomfort and emotional strain of pregnancy were secondary considerations to the ultimate goal. She was living in a state of suspended animation, her body no longer her own but a temporary vessel for the future of the dynasty. The moment of birth was not a private celebration, but a public event with high stakes. The household would wait in tense anticipation for the cry of a newborn. The first question was never, "Is the baby healthy?" but, "Is it a boy?" The arrival of a daughter, while often met with polite public congratulations, could be a private devastation. It was not that daughters were unloved, but they represented a delay, a failure to fulfill the primary objective. Each daughter born meant the pressure for the next pregnancy intensified exponentially. The wife had to endure the cycle again and again, her body subjected to the risks of childbirth, which were significant in an era before modern medicine, with the knowledge that only a son would bring true relief. And that relief, when it finally came, was often shockingly short-lived. The birth of the coveted heir in a spare was the ultimate success, the fulfillment of her contract. Yet for many women, this achievement marked the beginning of a new form of isolation. Having provided the necessary sons, her fundamental purpose to her husband and his family was largely complete. The romantic attentions that may have been part of the early marriage, however perfunctory, often ceased entirely, as the husband felt free to pursue his own interests elsewhere. The wife was left with the title of mother, but the actual rearing of the children was typically handed over to a staff of nurses and governesses, following aristocratic custom. She might have secured the lineage, but in doing so, she could find herself even more marginalized. Her role reduced to a biological function that, once performed, rendered her personally superfluous. The profound dehumanization of being valued not for who she was, but for the specific biological outcome she could produce, created a deep psychological wound that no title could ever truly heal. But within the suffocating confines of this gilded existence, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity to seek cracks of light. For every society wife who succumbed to quiet despair, there was another who discovered reservoirs of resilience and ingenuity, finding ways to assert her will and preserve a sense of self. Their rebellions took many forms, from the dangerously public to the intensely private, each one a declaration that they were more than just decorative assets or biological vessels. These acts of defiance were not always about breaking free entirely. Often, they were about carving out a small domain of autonomy within the vast territory controlled by others. The most explosive form of rebellion, of course, was the taking of a lover. For a woman like Jenny Jerome, this was not merely a search for romantic fulfillment missing in her marriage. It was a profound political statement. In an era where a man's infidelity was quietly tolerated, but a woman's could spell social ruin, an affair was a high-stakes gamble with her reputation. Yet for Jenny, the risk was worth the reward of passion, intellectual companionship, and most importantly, a reclamation of her own body and desires. Her relationship with Count Charles Kinsky, a dashing Austrian cavalry officer, was a poorly kept secret that electrified London society. It was an open challenge to the double standard that allowed her husband, Lord Randolph Churchill, his own indiscretions while expecting her to remain a placid symbol of propriety. These affairs were a way of seizing control, of asserting that her emotional and physical life was her own to govern, even if the law and society said otherwise. It was a defiant rattling of the cage bars, a declaration that she would not be defined solely by her marital disappointments. A more socially acceptable, yet equally powerful, form of resistance was the channeling of energy into philanthropy and intellectual pursuits. While a society wife was discouraged from having a career, charitable work was a sanctioned outlet for her talents and ambitions. This is where Consuelo Vanderbilt truly found her voice. After the outbreak of the First World War, she transformed the grand, drafty spaces of Blenheim Palace into a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers. This was not the decorative hostessing of peacetime. It was hands-on, meaningful labor. She organized the staff, managed supplies, and provided genuine comfort to the men recovering there. In this role, she was no longer just the Duchess, a beautiful accessory to her husband's title. She was a leader, a manager, a force for tangible good. This work gave her a purpose that her marriage never could, a sense of agency and accomplishment that began to fill the emotional void. Similarly, other heiresses became passionate patrons of the arts, funded educational initiatives, or championed causes like women's suffrage. By building hospitals, supporting artists, or advocating for social reform, they created legacies that were entirely their own, separate from the ancient titles they had married into. They used their wealth and social influence not just to maintain a system, but to improve the world around them, finding a powerful sense of identity in the process. Perhaps the most subtle and cunning rebellion was the strategic use of social influence itself. Denied formal power, these women became masters of the informal networks that truly governed aristocratic life. A skilled hostess understood that the conversations held in her drawing room after dinner could be more influential than debates in the House of Lords. She could make or break a reputation with a well-timed invitation or a carefully withheld compliment. By cultivating a salon of interesting thinkers, politicians, and artists, a woman could position herself at the center of intellectual life, shaping opinions and advancing causes she believed in. She might discreetly champion a political candidate her husband opposed, or use her social connections to smooth the path for a charitable project. This was a rebellion of whispers and suggestions, a way of wielding real power while meticulously maintaining the appearance of feminine deference. It was a brilliant manipulation of the very system that sought to constrain her, turning the tools of her oppression, her social obligations and hostessing duties, into instruments of her own quiet influence. Even in the most personal spheres, small acts of defiance flourished. A wife might insist on decorating her own private sitting room in a modern style that clashed with the ancient tapestries elsewhere in the house, creating a sanctuary that reflected her own taste. She might secretly correspond with friends back in America, keeping alive a connection to the more vibrant, less formal world she had left behind. She could develop a close, mentoring relationship with her children, particularly her daughters, instilling in them a spirit of independence that she herself had been forced to suppress. These were not grand gestures that would make the society pages, but they were vital assertions of individuality. Each choice, no matter how small, was a quiet victory, a reminder to herself that beneath the title and the tiara, she was still a person with her own desires, opinions, and will. These acts of rebellion, both large and small, were the lifeblood of a spirit refusing to be extinguished, proving that even the most magnificent cage could not completely contain the fierce and resilient soul within. Of course, the story of the Gilded Cage is not a simple monolith of universal suffering. While the tales of profound loneliness and emotional neglect are powerful and true, there existed another, quieter narrative for a select few women who discovered that the bars of their enclosure could, under the right circumstances, become the frame for a life of genuine purpose and even contentment. To only focus on the tragedies is to miss the complex reality that for some, the exchange of American freedom for European title was not a loss, but a surprising gain. The key difference lay not in the structure of the cage itself, which remained imposing, but in the unique combination of personality, partnership, and perspective that allowed certain women to find the lock and, remarkably, to find the key within themselves. Consider the story of Mary Lader, the daughter of a Chicago millionaire who made his fortune in department stores. Unlike Consuelo Vanderbilt, Mary was not a reluctant bride coerced into a marriage. Her union with George Nathaniel Curzon, a man of immense ambition and intellect who would become Viceroy of India, was a meeting of minds. Curzon was drawn to Mary's intelligence, her poise, and her thoughtful nature qualities that complemented his own driving personality rather than simply adorning it. In return, he treated her not as a beautiful accessory or a bank account, but as a trusted partner and confidante. He valued her opinions on politics and policy, discussing his work with her in depth and relying on her sharp judgment. This intellectual respect formed the foundation of a marriage that, while still a product of its social milieu, was built on a genuine mutual admiration. For Mary, who became Lady Curzon, the role of vicereine in India was not a burdensome duty, but the ultimate platform for her own capabilities. She embraced the immense responsibility with grace and skill, becoming a beloved and effective figure in her own right. Her influence felt in everything from social reforms to the preservation of Indian art. What made the cage more tolerable, even fulfilling, for a woman like Mary later? The character of the husband was perhaps the single most decisive factor. A man who viewed his wife as a partner rather than a purchase created an entirely different atmosphere within the marriage. When a husband encouraged his wife's intellect, sought her counsel, and shared his ambitions with her, the relationship could evolve beyond its transactional origins into a true companionship. This respect acted as a powerful antidote to the inherent loneliness of the position. Instead of being isolated in a cold palace, the wife became a central figure in a shared project, whether that project was governing an empire, managing a vast estate, or navigating the complex world of politics. The cage, in such cases, became less of a prison and more of a partnership with clearly defined but mutually respected walls. Equally important was the wife's own disposition and appetite for the role. Some women were simply better suited to the rigid formalities and public expectations of aristocratic life. A woman with a natural reserve, a keen intellect, and a genuine interest in history and tradition might find deep satisfaction in becoming the custodian of an ancient lineage. For her, the social rituals were not a tedious performance, but a meaningful connection to the past. The responsibility of managing a great household and entertaining influential guests could be seen as a challenging and worthwhile career, one that leveraged her organizational skills and social acuity. This stood in stark contrast to the more free-spirited American heiress, who chafed against the endless rules and found the whole system stiflingly artificial. A personality that thrived on order, ceremony, and public service could find the Gilded Cage to be a surprisingly comfortable fit, a structure that provided a sense of purpose and identity that a life of unstructured wealth might have lacked. Furthermore, some women discovered that their position granted them a unique form of power, one they learned to wield with subtlety and skill. Denied a direct voice in politics or business, they mastered the art of influence. The salon, the dinner party, the country house weekend, these were not just social gatherings, but the unofficial nerve centers of power. A politically astute hostess could shape policy, launch careers, and sway public opinion from her drawing room. She could champion causes she believed in, from public health to education, using her social capital and her husband's position to effect real change. For a woman with a sharp mind and a desire to make a difference, this behind-the-scenes influence could be profoundly satisfying. It was a different kind of power than the financial independence she might have enjoyed in America. But for some, it was a more potent and engaging form of agency. The cage, therefore, was not simply endured. It was mastered, its constraints navigated with such expertise that they became the very channels through which a woman could project her own will and intelligence onto the world. To truly grasp the confinement, we must walk the endless corridors and feel the chill in the grand halls. These palaces were far more than extravagant homes. They were the very bricks and mortar of the cage, physical manifestations of the centuries-old traditions that dictated every aspect of life. Consider Blenheim Palace, the Marlborough seat that became Consuelo Vanderbilt's world. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a masterpiece of English Baroque architecture, a monument to a nation's military history. For a young American woman, however, its sheer scale was overwhelming. With over 200 rooms, it was less a home and more a small, privately owned city. The famous Long Library stretches for over 180 feet, a breathtaking vista of leather-bound books and marble busts. But that immense length also meant a drafty, often frigid walk from one end to the other. The grandeur was inseparable from the discomfort. The management of such an estate was a logistical nightmare that fell squarely on the shoulders of the lady of the house. This was not simply choosing wallpaper or curtains. It was the command of a small army of servants. A place like Blenheim or the even vaster Chatsworth House in Derbyshire required a staff numbering in the dozens, if not more. There were butlers, footmen, cooks, scullery maids, housemaids, valets, ladies' maids, and a legion of outdoor staff for the gardens and stables. The society wife was effectively the chief executive officer of a major, nonprofit enterprise dedicated to the upkeep of a national treasure. Her days were consumed with approving menus, managing household accounts, and overseeing the intricate choreography of service that ensured every guest's stay was flawless. There was no room for error. A poorly managed dinner party could damage her husband's political prospects. A disorganized household was a stain on the family's honor. The house itself, with its endless demands, became a tyrant, its needs always superseding her own. Beyond the sheer workload, these homes were psychologically oppressive. They were museums to her husband's lineage, every corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge the new American arrival. Their eyes followed her, a constant silent reminder that she was a temporary resident in a story that had begun centuries before her birth. She lived surrounded by the artifacts of a history she had not inherited but purchased. The weight of that history was palpable in the cold stone walls, the ancient tapestries, the creak of floorboards worn down by generations of noble feet. This created a profound sense of impermanence and insecurity. No matter how much of her fortune was spent on restoring a wing or repairing a roof, she could never truly claim the place as her own. It would always belong to the lineage, to the son she had produced, to the ghosts of dukes past. She was a custodian, not an owner. And then there was the simple, inescapable reality of the cold. Before modern central heating, these monumental stone buildings were notoriously difficult to warm. Even with roaring fires in every fireplace, the heat often failed to penetrate the vast, high-ceilinged rooms. Drafts whistled through long galleries, and a pervasive dampness could seep into the bones. It was a physically uncomfortable existence, a constant battle against the elements within one's own home. The image of a duchess, swathed in furs and silks, huddled near a fireplace in a room the size of a modern apartment building, is a powerful symbol of the disconnect between the opulent appearance and the harsh reality. The jewels might sparkle, but the fingers that wore them were often numb. The physical chill of the palace mirrored the emotional coldness of a marital relationship that was more business partnership than romance. In this way, the architecture itself became an active participant in the confinement, its grandeur and its discomfort working in tandem to remind the society wife of the immense, unyielding nature of the world she had entered. If the grand estates were the architectural blueprint of the cage, then the wardrobe was its daily, tangible reality, a second skin of silk, satin, and steel that both defined and confined the society wife. Her clothing was never merely decorative. It was a complex and contradictory language, speaking volumes about her status, her wealth, and the immense pressures she faced. Each morning, the ritual began. She would be laced into a corset, a garment engineered not for comfort, but for the creation of an idealized silhouette. The tightening of the strings was a physical manifestation of the social constraints being cinched into place, molding her body to fit a rigid standard of beauty, just as her life was molded to fit aristocratic expectation. This foundation garment was the unseen architecture of her public self, a rigid frame upon which the rest of her identity would be carefully hung. Once corseted, she was adorned in layers of symbolic weight. A typical day required multiple complete changes of attire, each ensemble more elaborate than the last. The morning dress for receiving calls, the afternoon walking suit for a promenade in the park, the elaborate tea gown, and finally, the grand evening dress for dinner and the ball. These were not off-the-rack garments. They were custom creations from the most exclusive houses, most notably the atelier of Charles Frederick Worth in Paris, who dressed empresses and dollar princesses alike. A single Worth gown could cost a small fortune, equivalent to the annual income of a skilled tradesman. The fabrics were immensely heavy velvets, brocades, and silks embroidered with real pearls and metallic threads. Adorning it all were the jewels, not delicate pieces but substantial parures of diamonds, sapphires, and rubies, often commissioned as part of the marriage settlement. This staggering display served a crucial purpose. It was her armor. In the glittering, judgmental arena of high society, her clothing was her primary defense. A perfectly fitted Worth gown, accessorized with flawless gems, announced her family's financial power as clearly as a balance sheet. It signaled that her husband's estate was solvent, that her dowry was being put to magnificent use, and that she belonged in these rarefied circles. When she entered a ballroom, the collective gasp was not just for her beauty, but for the undeniable economic force she represented. In a world where she might be subtly marginalized for her American origins, her impeccable fashion was a defiant retort. It was a way of commanding respect, of silencing critics with a visual proclamation of worth that was impossible to ignore. The weight of the fabrics, the sparkle of the diamonds, created a formidable barrier between her vulnerable self and the prying eyes of the world. Yet, this magnificent armor was also an exquisitely tailored prison. The very corset that sculpted her into the fashionable hourglass shape restricted her breathing and made vigorous movement impossible. A deep breath was a luxury, a spontaneous laugh, a risk. The heavy skirts, supported by layers of petticoats, were cumbersome and isolating, creating a physical circumference that kept others at a prescribed distance. The entire ensemble was a masterclass in controlled movement. She learned to glide rather than walk, to gesture delicately rather than expressively, her body trained to exhibit a serene, statuesque grace under duress. The expectation of constant sartorial perfection was its own form of tyranny. There was no room for a simple, comfortable day. Even in the relative privacy of her home, she was expected to be impeccably dressed for every meal, every visitor. The need to be constantly on, visually flawless from dawn until late into the night, was a relentless performance that admitted no fatigue or frailty. This created a profound physical and psychological dissonance. Outwardly, she was the picture of opulent ease, a vision of wealth and leisure. Inwardly, she might be enduring significant physical discomfort, the ache of constricted ribs, the strain of carrying pounds of fabric and jewels, the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a composed posture for hours on end. The fashion of the era perfectly mirrored her existential predicament, magnificent to behold, but punishing to inhabit. Her wardrobe, therefore, was the ultimate symbol of the Gilded Cage. It was both her greatest weapon in the social battles she was forced to fight, and the most immediate physical evidence of her confinement, a daily reminder that her body, her time, and her very presence were not entirely her own to command. But the walls of this gilded cage were not opaque. They were transparent, under the constant and unforgiving glare of public attention. The society wife faced a confinement that extended far beyond the drafty halls of her palace, into the bustling newsrooms of 2 continents. This was the era when the modern media landscape was truly born, with mass circulation newspapers and illustrated society magazines hungry for a new kind of celebrity. And the dollar princesses were their perfect subjects, embodying an intoxicating mix of fabulous wealth, fairy tale romance, and ancient lineage that captivated a growing middle-class readership. Their lives became a form of public property, a serialized drama where every triumph was celebrated and every faltering step was magnified into a scandal. The press coverage was relentless and meticulously detailed. On both sides of the Atlantic, readers could follow the heiress's every move. When Consuelo Vanderbilt traveled to England for her wedding, American newspapers published exhaustive accounts of her trousseau, describing each gown and hat with breathless admiration. British papers, in turn, reported on her first appearances in London society, analyzing her demeanor, her accent, and her ability to navigate the complex rituals of the aristocracy. This was the paparazzi of the Gilded Age, armed not with cameras, but with notepads and a relentless curiosity. Their stories turned these women into living archetypes, the beautiful, innocent American heiress bringing vitality to the tired old world, or the cunning social climber using her fortune to buy her way into a title she didn't deserve. They had little control over this narrative. They were characters in a story written by others. This intense scrutiny turned the already immense pressure to perform perfection into an inescapable public mandate. A private misstep that might have been quietly overlooked within aristocratic circles could become front-page news. A moment of visible sadness at a ball, a disagreement overheard at the opera, a perceived slight from her husband, any of these could be spun into a story about marital discord. The most intimate and painful aspects of her life, particularly the agonizing pressure to produce a male heir, were discussed openly in the press. If months or years passed without a pregnancy announcement, speculative articles would begin to appear, questioning her health, or her ability to fulfill her primary duty. The birth of a daughter might be reported with a hint of condescension, while the arrival of a son was treated as a national event. This public dissection of her most private biological functions added a layer of humiliating exposure to an already stressful ordeal, making her body a subject for public debate and judgment. The media fascination also created a bizarre double standard that deepened the wife's sense of isolation. While her own actions were policed with Victorian strictness, her husband's indiscretions were often reported with a wink and a nod, if they were reported at all. The aristocratic code of silence frequently protected the men, allowing their affairs to continue as poorly kept secrets within their social set, but sparing them the full force of public condemnation. The wife, however, was held to an impossible standard of flawless virtue. Any hint of her seeking companionship or comfort outside her marriage, no matter how lonely or neglected she might be, risked catastrophic scandal. This unequal treatment trapped her in a state of hyper-vigilance, where she had to be constantly aware of who was watching, who might be listening, and how any action could be misinterpreted and splashed across the newspapers the next day. The fear of becoming a headline was a powerful silencer, another bar added to her cage. In many ways, the press became an unwitting enforcer of the very system that confined these women. By relentlessly covering their lavish parties, their exquisite gowns, and their seemingly perfect lives, the media reinforced the fairy tale narrative that this was a destiny to be envied. They sold the illusion of the gilded cage as a dream come true, encouraging other ambitious families to pursue the same path. For the woman living inside that dream, however, the coverage was a cruel distortion. The public saw the glittering surface, but she lived the quiet desperation underneath. The newspapers chronicled the splendor of her life, but never the solitude, reported on her public smiles, but never her private tears. This created a profound disconnect between her reality and her reputation, forcing her to maintain a magnificent facade for an audience of millions, making the performance of her life the most demanding role she would ever play. The true measure of this gilded confinement, however, extends far beyond the lifetimes of the women who endured it, echoing most powerfully in the lives of the children they raised within those magnificent walls. For these society wives, motherhood presented a profound dilemma, a chance to either perpetuate the cycle that had broken them or to forge a new path for the next generation. Once they gained a measure of agency, often through the hard-won independence of divorce or the confidence of later years, many directed their energies toward ensuring their daughters would not face the same heartbreaking choices. They had been traded as assets, but they were determined to raise their daughters to be architects of their own destinies. This shift in parenting philosophy was revolutionary. A woman like Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had been utterly powerless in her own youth, became a fiercely supportive and modern mother to her two sons. She made a conscious effort to shield them from the emotional coldness that had defined her marriage, fostering an environment where their feelings and opinions were valued. She encouraged their education, their interests, and most importantly, their empathy. The result of this nurturing was a relationship built on mutual respect, one that would be tested during the most defining moment of her later life, her decision to seek a divorce from the Duke of Marlborough. In a stunning reversal of aristocratic tradition, Both of her sons, John and Ivor, supported their mother's pursuit of freedom. They had witnessed her profound unhappiness firsthand and understood that her personal well-being mattered more than the preservation of a hollow social facade. Their support was not merely passive acceptance. It was an active endorsement, a signal of a generational shift in which personal happiness began to outweigh rigid social obligation. This was perhaps Consuelo's greatest victory, not just her own escape, but the raising of sons who championed her right to have one. The legacy was more complex for daughters. Some mothers, scarred by their own experiences, actively steered their girls away from titled Europeans, instead encouraging marriages based on companionship and genuine affection, often with fellow Americans. They used their hard-won wisdom to redefine success for their children, prioritizing emotional fulfillment over social conquest. Yet, for others, the allure of a title and the ingrained belief in its protective power remained surprisingly potent. Having achieved the pinnacle of social status themselves, they sometimes found it difficult to imagine a better alternative for their daughters, viewing a brilliant match as the ultimate form of security, a paradox where the very cage that trapped them was still seen as the safest place for their children. This generational evolution finds its most poignant symbol in the life of Consuelo Vanderbilt's younger son, Ivor. Unlike his elder brother John, who inherited the Marlborough title and the immense burden of Blenheim Palace, Ivor was free to live a life untethered from those expectations. He became a well-regarded member of Parliament, but his most significant legacy was his own marriage. He married an American actress named Elizabeth Yon, a union that was a world away from the transactional contract of his parents. It was a love match chosen freely and based on shared affection. In Ivor's life, we see the full circle of his mother's influence. He escaped the dynastic pressures that had ensnared her, embodying the very ideal of personal choice she had been denied. His story demonstrates that the most lasting impact of these women was not the fortunes they saved or the palaces they restored, but the new values they instilled in their children, values of empathy, autonomy, and the courageous pursuit of a life defined by love rather than duty. The bars of the gilded cage, once so unyielding, began to bend not with force, but with the gentle, persistent power of a mother's hope for a different future. While the walls of the gilded cage were thick with tradition and social expectation, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the courtrooms and legislative halls that would, brick by brick, begin to dismantle them. For decades, the legal system had been the ultimate enforcer of a woman's confinement, but a gradual, hard-fought shift in laws eventually provided the tools for her liberation. The most significant of these tools was the reform of divorce law, a transformation that moved at a glacial pace, but with tectonic force. For a society wife, the prospect of divorce in the late 19th century was not just scandalous. It was a legal and financial impossibility that guaranteed social exile and destitution. The system was grotesquely unbalanced. A husband could divorce his wife for a single act of adultery, which was seen as a violation of his property rights. A wife, however, faced a much higher bar. She had to prove not only adultery, but also an additional aggravating offense, such as cruelty, desertion, or incest. This double standard legally sanctioned the very behavior that caused so much misery for women like Consuelo Vanderbilt. effectively giving husbands a license for infidelity while trapping their wives in a state of permanent, unbreakable obligation. The turning point began not with a single dramatic event, but with the cumulative pressure of social change, much of it driven by the very women who had been most constrained by the old rules. The suffrage movement, which fought for a woman's right to vote, was intrinsically linked to the fight for broader legal personhood, including the right to escape a disastrous marriage. As women began to claim a voice in the public sphere, the injustice of their status in private law became increasingly difficult to ignore. The horrors of the First World War also played a crucial role, shattering Victorian certainties and accelerating a demand for a more modern and equitable society. In this new atmosphere, the cries for legal reform grew louder and more impossible for Parliament to dismiss. The campaign was a long and arduous one, but it culminated in a landmark piece of legislation that would prove to be a master key for the Gilded Age, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923. This act was revolutionary in its simplicity and its power. It erased the centuries-old double standard by granting women the same right as men to petition for divorce on the sole ground of their spouse's adultery. No longer would a wife have to prove an additional, often difficult to demonstrate offense. This change was monumental. For the first time, the law acknowledged a fundamental equality in the marital contract. A woman's fidelity was deemed as valuable as a man's, and a husband's adultery was recognized as a legitimate reason for his wife to sever the union. While divorce was still a socially drastic step, the Act of 1923 provided a clear, accessible, and dignified legal pathway. It transformed divorce from a near impossible dream into a tangible, if still daunting, possibility. For a woman like Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had endured over 2 decades of a cold and lonely marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, the timing of this legal shift was profoundly significant. Her own personal journey toward independence had been progressing for years, fueled by her wartime work and a growing sense of self. The new law did not create her desire for freedom, but it provided the legitimate mechanism to achieve it. When she filed for divorce in 1921, just 2 years before the act was passed, the old, unequal law still technically applied. However, the changing social winds that made the 1923 Act possible were already blowing, creating an environment where her case could be heard with a degree of sympathy that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Her divorce, granted on the grounds of the Duke's adultery, became a symbol of this new era. It demonstrated that even the highest levels of society were not immune to the demands for personal happiness and legal equity. The act, when it passed, locked in this new reality, ensuring that the women who followed her would have an even clearer and more equitable path out of their own gilded enclosures. It was a testament to the power of persistent reform, a key fashioned not from gold, but from the principles of justice, finally offered to the women who had been locked away for so long. The stories of Consuelo Vanderbilt and Jenny Jerome were so compelling, so rich with drama and tragedy, that they almost seem like the stuff of fiction. And in many ways, they are. The writers who were their contemporaries, keen observers of this transatlantic social upheaval, recognized a powerful new subject for literature. Authors like Edith Wharton and Henry James became the great chroniclers of this world, translating the quiet desperation of the society wife into some of the most enduring novels in the American canon. They saw that the collision of new American money with old European tradition created a perfect crucible for exploring universal themes of ambition, morality, and the human cost of social climbing. Edith Wharton, who moved in the very highest circles of New York society, wrote with an insider's sharp eye for its rules and its cruelties. Her masterpiece, The House of Mirth, published in 1905, is practically a case study of the Gilded Age, even if its setting is Manhattan rather than an English castle. Her heroine, Lily Bart, is a devastatingly beautiful woman who has been raised for one purpose: to make a brilliant marriage. She possesses the charm and grace of a Consuelo Vanderbilt, but she lacks the immense fortune. This makes her situation even more precarious. Lily is trapped not by a specific husband, but by the entire system that values her only for her beauty and her social utility. She is a prisoner of expectation, navigating a world where a single misstep, a whispered rumor, or a rejected advance from a powerful man can lead to a swift and irreversible social downfall. Wharton's genius was in showing that the cage was not always made of titles and palaces. It could be constructed from the velvet ropes of a New York ballroom, and its bars were just as unyielding. Across the Atlantic, Henry James explored similar territory, but often through the lens of the innocent American encountering the sophisticated and frequently corrupt world of Europe. In The Portrait of a Lady, published in 1881, he gives us Isabel Archer, a bright, independent-minded young woman who unexpectedly inherits a fortune. With this new wealth, she believes she has bought her freedom, the power to shape her own destiny. Instead, she falls prey to the machinations of older, more worldly figures and enters into a marriage that becomes a prison of exquisite subtlety. Her husband, Gilbert Osmond, is not a brutish tyrant, but a cold, controlling aesthete who values appearances above all else. He seeks to mold Isabel into the perfect wife, a beautiful object to adorn his life, crushing her spirit in the process. James captures the psychological dimension of the cage with profound insight. For Isabel, the confinement is not just social or financial. It is the slow, suffocating death of her own vibrant individuality, a tragedy that unfolds in the quiet, well-appointed rooms of a Roman palazzo. These literary works were more than just entertainment. They were powerful social critiques. Wharton and James were holding a mirror up to their society, asking their readers to consider the human toll of treating marriage as a market and women as commodities. They give a voice to the silent suffering that occurred behind closed doors, giving a name to the vague discontent that many women of their class felt but could not articulate. The enduring power of these novels lies in the fact that they are not period pieces. The specific social rules may have changed, but the core dilemmas remain deeply relevant. The tension between personal desire and family expectation, the search for identity within constricting roles, and the complex relationship between money, freedom, and happiness. This fascination has certainly not faded with time. In fact, it has found a vibrant new life on television with Julian Fellowes' series, The Gilded Age. Fellowes, who previously explored the rigid hierarchies of British aristocracy in Downton Abbey, turns his attention to the very same world that produced the Dollar Princesses. The show brilliantly dramatizes the social warfare between old New York and the new industrial fortunes, with the ambitious Bertha Russell acting as a fictional stand-in for formidable matriarchs like Alva Vanderbilt. Bertha's single-minded mission to break into the sacred circle of Mrs. Astor's society, using her daughter Gladys as a key pawn in her strategy, is a direct echo of the real-life stories we have been exploring. We see the negotiations, the snubs, the extravagant parties thrown as weapons in a social battle, all the machinery that led to the transatlantic marriage market. What makes the Gilded Age so compelling for a modern audience is its ability to mine the drama from both sides of the equation. We see the thrilling ambition of the newcomers, but we also understand the fear and disdain of the old guard, who see their world being invaded by what they consider vulgar new money. The show understands that the cage was not just a prison for the women who married into titles. It was also a defensive structure built by the established elite to protect their own fading power. The continued popularity of this narrative, from the pages of Wharton to the screens of today, proves that the story of the society wife trapped in a gilded cage is more than a historical curiosity. It is a timeless exploration of the price of ambition and the eternal human yearning for authenticity in a world that often values the glittering surface above all else. While the grand dramas of English dukes and their American brides have captured our imagination, the transatlantic marriage market was a truly continental affair. The hunger for American capital extended far beyond the British Isles, reaching into the heart of Europe, where ancient princely families presided over tiny, yet fiercely proud, sovereign states. A young heiress might find herself not just a duchess, but a princess or even a serene highness, traded to a court where the protocols were even more Byzantine and the isolation could be far more profound. In these smaller German principalities or Italian noble families, the cage was often smaller, its bars forged from traditions that were older and even less forgiving. Consider the journey of an heiress who married into a minor German principality, a place like Thurn-on-Taxis or the House of Sayn-Wittgenstein. While a British duke had to navigate the complexities of London society, his world was still relatively cosmopolitan. In a secluded German castle, however, the new princess was plunged into an environment that was intensely provincial and insular. The court language was almost exclusively German, a significant barrier for an American woman who likely had only a conversational grasp of French. Every interaction, from reading the morning correspondence to understanding the subtle insults of her new relatives, became a linguistic challenge. Beyond language, the cultural gap was immense. The rigid hierarchy of a small German court was absolute, with every person's rank and privilege meticulously defined. An American sense of informality or directness, which might have been merely frowned upon in England, could be seen as a shocking breach of etiquette in a setting where the prince's authority was near divine. The isolation in these European enclaves was often more severe than anything experienced in Britain. A place like Blenheim Palace, for all its grandeur, was within a day's travel of London's social world. But a castle in the Black Forest or the hills of Tuscany could be days away from any major city. The society wife was stranded in a world where the primary entertainment was the intricate and often petty politics of the local court. Her circle was limited to the same small group of nobles and officials, all watching her every move with a critical eye. There were no quick escapes to a bustling metropolis. Her entire universe was contained within the stone walls of her new home and the stiflingly formal routines that governed life there. This physical remoteness amplified the emotional loneliness, cutting her off not only from her family in America, but also from the kind of expatriate community that might have provided solace in London. The nature of the transaction could also feel even more blatant in these smaller states. While the British aristocracy had vast estates and global prestige, many minor German princes were essentially land-rich, but cash-poor monarchs of postage-stamp kingdoms. The infusion of American dollars was not just for refurbishing a wing. It was often to prop up the entire financial structure of the miniature state. The pressure on the princess to perform her duty was therefore immense. She was quite literally the savior of the dynasty, and her success in producing an heir was a matter of national stability. This magnified the biological imperative to an almost unbearable degree, turning her personal life into a matter of state concern monitored by courtiers and ministers. The grandeur of her title, Her Serene Highness, often masked a reality of intense scrutiny and a complete loss of personal autonomy, proving that the Gilded Cage knew no national borders, only varying shades of velvet lining. This relentless pressure to perform, combined with the deep emotional isolation, exacted a devastating psychological price that often manifested in ways both visible and hidden. Behind the serene smiles and the glittering public facade, many of these women were suffering from a profound and debilitating anguish. In the medical parlance of the Gilded Age, their condition had a name: neurasthenia. Coined by the American neurologist George Miller Beard, the term described a state of nervous exhaustion, a depletion of the nervous system's vital energy. Its symptoms were a perfect catalog of the society wife's inner turmoil: chronic fatigue, anxiety, insomnia, headaches, and a general sense of malaise and depression. For a physician of the era, the diagnosis was straightforward. Modern life, with its rapid pace, its new technologies like the telegraph and the railroad, was simply too stimulating for the delicate female constitution. The prescribed cure was the infamous rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, which involved complete bed rest, isolation, a heavy milk-based diet, and a strict prohibition on any intellectual or creative activity. The very things that might have provided a woman with a lifeline out of her despair. Looking back through a modern lens, we can see that this diagnosis was a profound misreading of the cause, even if it accurately described the symptoms. These women were not suffering from an overstimulation by the modern world. They were being psychologically crushed by an ancient and rigid social system. Their nervous exhaustion was not a medical mystery, but a perfectly rational response to an intolerable situation. The constant demand to suppress one's true feelings, to smile through profound unhappiness, and to navigate a world of subtle humiliations would strain even the most resilient psyche. The lack of any meaningful control over their own lives, from their finances to their daily routines, created a state of learned helplessness, a recognized precursor to depression. The profound loneliness of being surrounded by people yet having no one to confide in is a known risk factor for anxiety disorders. What Victorian doctors pathologized as a weakness of the female nervous system, we can now recognize as the predictable mental health consequences of a life devoid of autonomy, authenticity, and connection. The so-called cures, tragically, often exacerbated the very conditions they were meant to alleviate. The rest cure was a prescription that mirrored the pathology of the gilded cage itself. It demanded further passivity, further isolation, and a complete surrender of agency. A woman like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who famously wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, based on her own harrowing experience with the treatment, described it as a form of torture that pushed her to the brink of madness. To be confined to a room, forbidden from writing or reading, and treated as a hysterical child was to reenact the powerlessness of her daily life in a more concentrated and terrifying form. It was a medical endorsement of the idea that a woman's best state was a silent, supine one. For a society wife already trapped in a life of enforced idleness and emotional silence, this cure was simply a more intense version of her disease, stripping away the few distractions and small rebellions that might have been keeping her sane. We can only imagine the private struggles of women like Consuelo Vanderbilt, who spoke later in life of her profound unhappiness, the ceaseless headaches, the bouts of melancholy, the overwhelming sense of fatigue she must have felt were not signs of fragility, but of a spirit in conflict with its environment. For every woman who sought a controversial escape through a lover or the dramatic break of divorce, there were countless others who internalized their suffering, their distress manifesting in physically debilitating ways that the world dismissed as feminine weakness. Their bodies, through illness, were expressing what their minds and mouths were forbidden to say, that the gilded cage, for all its splendor, was a place of profound and soul-crushing distress. Their legacy is a stark reminder that no amount of external wealth can compensate for the poverty of a life lived without freedom, purpose, or love, and that the human mind has its own limits, which will assert themselves when the spirit is relentlessly suppressed. While the grand ballrooms of the Gilded Age may seem a world away, the architecture of the Gilded Cage has proven remarkably adaptable, finding new forms in the glaring light of the 21st century. We no longer trade dowries for duchies and formal contracts, but the exchange of personal autonomy for social status and material security continues in ways that are both startlingly familiar and uniquely modern. Today's equivalent is not always a literal palace, but a life curated for public consumption, where the pressure to maintain a flawless image can be just as suffocating as any Victorian code of conduct. Consider the world of the celebrity wife or the partner of a tech billionaire. She may live in a minimalist glass mansion rather than a stone castle, but her existence is often a performance dictated by brand partnerships and public relations strategies. Her value is frequently tied to her ability to embody an ideal: the perfectly supportive spouse, the effortlessly chic mother, the serene influencer whose life is an endless stream of enviable moments. Her social media feed becomes the new ballroom, a space where every post is scrutinized, every vacation photo analyzed for clues about the health of her marriage and the success of her family. The pressure to present a united, happy front, even amidst rumored turmoil, is immense. A public misstep, a poorly worded tweet, a paparazzi shot without a wedding ring can trigger a media firestorm, damaging not just her reputation, but her partner's brand and financial standing. Her autonomy is quietly surrendered to the demands of maintaining a marketable image, her life becoming an asset to be managed by a team of publicists, just as the Dollar Princess's life was managed by her husband's family. This modern cage is also reinforced by a new kind of financial dependency. While prenuptial agreements have replaced the old laws of coverture, the power dynamics can be strikingly similar. A woman who steps away from her own career to support her high-profile husband's ambitions may find herself years later with a diminished resume, her own professional identity eclipsed by his success. Her access to a life of luxury is entirely contingent on the continuation of the marriage. Walking away, even from an unhappy union, means walking away from the entire ecosystem of wealth, security, and social standing she has become accustomed to. This creates a powerful incentive to endure, to smile for the cameras, and to silence her own discontent. The fear of losing not just a partner, but a lifestyle and a public identity can be a more effective prison than any legal document from the 19th century. Perhaps the most pervasive modern parallel, however, is the self-imposed cage of social media perfection. Unlike the society wife who performed for a limited aristocratic circle, millions now perform for a global audience, building their own personal brand. The drive to present a life of curated happiness, exotic travel, and material abundance creates a relentless pressure to keep up appearances. This pursuit of a flawless online facade can lead to a profound disconnect between one's authentic self and the manufactured persona presented to the world. The anxiety of maintaining this illusion, of constantly comparing one's behind-the-scenes reality to everyone else's highlight reel, generates a unique form of modern isolation. You can be surrounded by digital followers yet feel utterly alone, trapped by the very platform you built to connect with others. The quest for external validation through likes and comments becomes a new kind of social currency, one that is just as fickle and demanding as the approval of a 19th century duchess. In this light, the gilded cage is no longer something one is forced into by an ambitious parent. It is a structure we are often complicit in building for ourselves, bar by glittering bar, in the relentless pursuit of an impossible standard of perfection. And so we arrive at the complex and lasting legacy of these extraordinary women, a story far richer than a simple tragedy. While it is true that they were often victims of a ruthless system, traded like commodities to solve the financial crises of fading aristocracies, to view them only as passive prisoners is to miss the heart of their narrative. In a very real sense, these society wives were pioneers, navigating an uncharted and perilous frontier between the dynamic new world of American industry and the ancient, entrenched power of European tradition. They were the human bridges connecting two vastly different cultures, and they paid the price for that connection with their personal freedom. Their stories, filled with loneliness and quiet despair, are undeniably heartbreaking. Yet, woven through the sadness is a powerful thread of resilience. Consider the sheer courage it took for Consuelo Vanderbilt, after decades of duty, to finally seek a divorce and reclaim her life. Think of Jenny Jerome's fiery spirit, defiantly seeking passion and intellectual engagement in a world that demanded she be seen and not heard. Remember the quieter rebellions, the philanthropic work that gave purpose, the subtle wielding of social influence, the small, private acts of preserving one's own identity. These were not women who simply surrendered. They fought their confinement with the tools available to them, demonstrating a strength of character that commands respect across the centuries. Ultimately, the true lesson of the Gilded Cage is that the key was never a physical object to be found, but an internal quality to be claimed: self-determination. For some, like Mary later, that meant finding purpose and partnership within the system's walls. For others, like Consuelo, it meant the brave and difficult decision to walk away. The common thread is the assertion of one's own will, the decision to define one's life on one's own terms, however imperfectly. This is a lesson that resonates with profound power today, in an era where the pressures of social media, career ambition, and curated lifestyles can create cages of their own, just as glittering and just as confining. The legacy of these women is a timeless reminder that wealth and status are empty vessels without the fundamental freedom to choose your own path. We have journeyed through ballrooms and palaces, through heartbreak and rebellion. Now, we would love to hear your thoughts. Which of these stories did you find most compelling? Was it the tragic archetype of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the defiant complexity of Jenny Jerome, or the quieter resilience of others? And looking around at our modern world, where you see echoes of the Gilded Cage today, share your reflections in the comments below. Let's continue this fascinating conversation about the enduring human quest for authenticity in a world that often values the gilded surface above all else.